been warned multiple times about the state of your lawn.
Ma'am, this is harassment.
This is your final notice.
The morning that Karen, president of our pristine Lakeside HOA, slapped a hefty fine on my wheelchair-bound dad for unsightly equipment, outside his porch started with the kind of golden sunrise that normally makes you grateful just to be alive. But that day, gratitude was replaced by the sting of outrage. My father, a Vietnam vet who'd spent 40 years teaching high school history before a spinal injury left him rolling instead of walking, had placed a small ramp on the porch so he could get in and out safely. To the rest of us neighbors, it wasn't just a ramp. It was a lifeline, a piece of freedom that allowed him to water his flowers, wave at the mailman, and breathe in the crisp lake air each morning. To Karen, however, it was apparently a violation of community aesthetics, a phrase she brandished with the same relish she reserved for her glossy clipboard and oversized sunglasses. Karen had a reputation for policing mailbox colors and grass length, but this fine felt different. It was cruel, a direct strike at someone who could least defend himself. My dad's hands trembled as he showed me the notice, a yellow slip glaring with Karen's signature. I could almost hear her triumphant smirk in the tidy cursive at the bottom. She had no idea, of course, who I was to become in this story, or what title would one day make her freeze in a courtroom. To her, I was just a dutiful son who would either quietly pay or quietly leave. But I had spent my life in public service, walking the same neighborhoods, shaking the same hands, earning trust long before I ever wore a mayoral sash. I'd learned that real leadership wasn't about wielding power to intimidate. It was about protecting people who couldn't fight alone. And this was personal at first. I tried to brush it off, reminding myself that Karen thrived on provoking people, that perhaps she'd made a misstep she would correct if reason prevailed. But as the day wore on, I overheard whispers among neighbors. Karen had been telling people Dad's ramp lowered property values and set a bad precedent. That wasn't just a mistake, that was a campaign. The more I thought about the way she strutted past Dad's porch, her manicured fingers gripping violation slips like weapons, the more I understood that silence would only feed her arrogance. She'd picked on retirees for bird feeders, fined families for cheerful paint colors, and bullied single moms for lawn ornaments. But a wheelchair ramp? That crossed a line deeper than any regulation book. Still, I knew the danger of meeting fire with fire. Bullies like Karen counted on people to lose their tempers, to make mistakes that could be twisted into proof of guilt. So I started quietly gathering information. I photographed Dad's ramp from every angle, noting how neatly it fit the porch and how little space it occupied. I pulled county accessibility guidelines and state housing regulations, highlighting the sections that mandated reasonable accommodation for disability access, rules that superseded any HOA whim. I even visited a couple of neighbors she'd previously harassed, collecting their stories. The Martins admitted she'd once fined them for a flagpole placed at a distracting angle. Old Bob, who loved grilling, told me Karen had accused him of olfactory offenses when the smell of ribs drifted her way. It was all small stuff before, but together, it painted a picture of a petty tyrant ruling through intimidation. By evening, Dad was quiet, staring at the lake as if it might carry his worries away. I sat beside him, heart heavy yet simmering with resolve. The ramp wasn't just wooden screws. It was his dignity. I thought of the veterans he'd mentored, the students he'd inspired, and the countless hours he'd spent giving to others. Karen had chosen the wrong target. And while she saw only an aging man in a wheelchair and his seemingly powerless son, she didn't know the depth of the community ties I'd built or the authority I could bring to bear if pushed far enough. What Karen also didn't know was that her own spotless reputation was a facade. Beneath her polished exterior lay cracks she'd been hiding for years. Cracks I was now determined to find. Because as much as this started with a simple violation slip, it was about to become a reckoning that would shake our entire neighborhood. The lake that had always mirrored the sky so peacefully was about to reflect a storm. And I was ready to be the thunder. The next few days unfolded like the tightening of a noose. Each sunrise on the lake bringing fresh evidence that Karen had no intention of relenting. She doubled down, posting a printed notice on the HOA board proclaiming that non-compliant structures would result in escalating fines, a thinly veiled warning aimed squarely at my father. Neighbors began whispering at mailboxes and on sidewalks, some offering sympathetic nods when they thought Karen wasn't watching, others retreating into polite silence rather than risk her wrath. I could feel the unease in the community. People who'd quietly endured her tyranny for years were watching to see what I'd do, perhaps hoping someone else would draw the line they'd been too afraid to mark. I kept my composure, outwardly calm as I mowed Dad's lawn or waved to passing cars, but inwardly I was mapping every move. I spent evenings combing through county ordinances and federal disability accommodation laws, making meticulous notes and printing out pages to add to a growing binder of evidence. My past as a public servant had taught me that the surest way to topple a bully was not with rage, but with preparation. Each fact I uncovered became another brick in the wall I was quietly building between my father and Karen's grasping claws. Meanwhile, Karen strutted the neighborhood like a self-appointed monarch, her designer sandals clicking on the pavement, her clipboard tucked under her arm like a scepter. She paraded her authority in small, cutting ways, snapping photos of a child's sidewalk chalk drawing as if it were graffiti, reprimanding a widower for leaving his trash can out past noon, even gossiping at a barbecue about certain residents who think they're above the rules. I saw through her performance. She needed to project control because beneath the surface, she feared losing it. That fear showed in subtle cracks, the quick dart of her eyes when neighbors avoided her gaze, the tightness in her jaw when I passed by without flinching. She sensed, perhaps before she even admitted it to herself, that her grip on the community was slipping. But she couldn't stop, because bullies rarely know when to quit. They press harder, convinced that louder threats will keep everyone in line. One humid evening, as cicadas hummed in the trees, I met quietly with a small circle of neighbors on Bob's back deck. They brought their stories, their frustration, and, most importantly, their willingness to stand together. The Martins recounted the time Karen threatened to fine them for having wind chimes she claimed were noise pollution. A young couple revealed she had forced them to uproot a native flower bed for not being aesthetically uniform. The more they spoke, the more I saw their eyes shift from fear to determination. These were ordinary, decent people who'd been cowed into silence, and now they were finding their voices. I promised them I wouldn't let Karen's cruelty toward my father stand, but I also warned that any confrontation had to be handled legally and strategically. We weren't going to stoop to her level. We were going to rise above it with truth, law, and unity. In the days that followed, I documented everything with the precision of a seasoned investigator. I photographed Karen's own yard, noticing the small infractions she'd overlooked on her property, an unapproved shed addition that extended over the HOA boundary line, a decorative stone pathway she'd never filed for approval, even an oversized boat trailer parked for weeks in a common area where long-term storage was expressly forbidden. I dug through HOA meeting minutes, finding no record of her receiving approval for these things. Each discovery was a reminder that Karen's authority was a performance propped up by intimidation, not integrity. My binder grew thick, pages tabbed and highlighted, evidence layered like sediment recording years of hypocrisy. As the tension mounted, Karen escalated further, issuing an official final warning letter claiming that failure to remove the ramp within 7 days would result in legal action and daily fines. The bold typeface screamed arrogance, but I felt a flicker of pity beneath my anger. She had no idea she was constructing her own downfall plank by plank. My father watched all this with quiet dignity, refusing to let bitterness touch his voice. He watered his flowers each morning, rolled down the ramp she despised, and greeted neighbors with a steady kindness that made her hostility look even uglier. I found myself more determined than ever to protect that dignity. The breaking point came when Karen scheduled an emergency HOA meeting, plastering flyers on every mailbox with language about preserving community standards. I attended without a word of protest, taking my usual seat near the back with the binder resting on my lap like a concealed weapon. I let her lecture, let her sway her loyalists with exaggerated warnings about property values plummeting, let her point to Dad's ramp as if it were the harbinger of ruin. Inside, my resolve hardened like steel. This was no longer about a simple fine. It was about whether decency could survive in a place where power had been abused for too long. And as the sun set beyond the lake that night, casting streaks of amber across the water. I felt the quiet confidence that comes when you know the storm you're bringing is righteous. The ramp would stay, my father's dignity would remain intact. And Karen was about to discover that her throne wasn't as unshakable as she believed. The night after Karen's emergency HOA meeting, I sat at my kitchen table under the dim glow of a single lamp. Binder spread open like a battle map, and finalized the plan that would turn the tide. Every piece of evidence was in order. Photos of Dad's ramp proving its neat construction. County and federal codes guaranteeing his right to reasonable accommodation. Documented examples of Karen's selective enforcement. And even a few quietly gathered signatures from neighbors attesting to her harassment over the years. I added one last section, a summary of her own unapproved structures and the oversized boat trailer she'd parked for months in a common area without permission. These weren't just embarrassing oversights. They were direct violations of the very rules she had weaponized against others. Early the next morning, I drove to the county courthouse, where I had long-standing relationships forged during years of community work and public service. I filed the necessary paperwork to request a preliminary injunction against the HOA's fines and to schedule a hearing before a district judge. The clerk recognized my name and offered a small, knowing smile as she stamped the documents. The hearing was set for the following week, a timeline that gave me just enough time to prepare and just enough rope for Karen to tighten her own noose with more arrogance. Over the next several days, Karen's behavior reached almost theatrical levels. She walked the neighborhood like a patrolling sentry, making pointed remarks within earshot of anyone who would listen about residents who think they're untouchable. She sent out a mass email dripping with veiled threats, warning that non-compliance will not be tolerated, regardless of sentimentality or personal hardships. To an outsider, it might have looked like a show of strength, but to those of us who knew the law, it reeked of desperation. The whispers among neighbors grew louder, their patience with her tyranny thinning like ice in early spring. Even some of her closest loyalists began to hedge their support, offering lukewarm nods rather than enthusiastic applause at her self-congratulatory speeches. I kept my composure through it all, greeting people warmly, helping Bob fix his grill again, and making sure my father's ramp was freshly swept and adorned with a small potted plant of cheerful marigolds. The sight of that bright yellow flower beside the ramp seemed to lift my father's spirits. Even as the tension swirled around us on the morning of the hearing, the lake was wrapped in mist, the kind that blurs the horizon and makes everything feel suspended in time. Dad wheeled himself onto the porch, calm but clearly nervous, and I reassured him that the law was on our side. As we arrived at the courthouse, a few neighbors quietly gathered outside for moral support, their presence a silent rebuke to Karen's reign. Inside, Karen stood at the far end of the hallway, clipboard in hand even here, dressed in a blazer a shade too bright for the somber walls. She glanced at me with that familiar smirk, the one she wore when she believed she was untouchable. She hadn't yet seen the judge's docket listing beside our case. She hadn't yet realized that her threats had brought her to a battlefield where her power plays meant nothing. As the courtroom filled with the low murmur of spectators and the rustle of paperwork, Karen preened like a cat certain of its victory. I waited quietly, my binder resting on the table, my father's hand lightly on my arm as if to ground me. When the bailiff called the case and the judge entered, the room fell silent. It wasn't just any judge who stepped forward, but an old colleague from my years on the city council, someone who knew my commitment to fairness and accessibility. The formality of the proceedings masked the flicker of recognition in his eyes when he read my name on the case file. Karen's smirk faltered just slightly, her brow furrowing as if trying to place a half-remembered face. The judge began reviewing the preliminary motions, flipping through the paperwork with an efficiency born of years on the bench. My evidence binder slid across the table with a soft thud, page after page of carefully documented facts now resting in the judge's hands. As Karen presented her argument about preserving aesthetic harmony and property values, her voice carried the brittle edge of someone clinging to a crumbling narrative. The judge's questions grew sharper, probing whether the HOA had considered federal disability accommodation laws, whether they had applied standards consistently to all residents, and whether Karen herself had secured approval for her own structures. By the time she stumbled through an evasive answer about the boat trailer, A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge then turned to me, inviting my statement. I spoke calmly about my father's service, his injury, the ramp's importance to his daily life, and the necessity of protecting every resident's dignity, not just the able-bodied or the favored. I reminded the court of the law's supremacy over HOA preferences, weaving in citations that underscored that community regulations cannot override accessibility rights. The judge listened carefully, nodding occasionally, then leaned back in his chair, studying Karen with a look that could slice through stone. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that signals a shift in power. Karen's hands tightened around her clipboard, her nails leaving faint crescents in the polished wood. The judge set the hearing for a full review the following week, granting an immediate suspension of all fines and warning the HOA against further harassment. As we exited the courtroom, Karen's once confident steps seemed a little less steady, her bright blazer looking more like a costume than a badge of authority. But the true moment that would freeze her, the moment that would ripple through the entire community, was still waiting on the horizon, poised to land with the force of poetic justice she'd never see coming. The week between the preliminary hearing and the final court date stretched taut with anticipation. The lake community humming with a mix of curiosity and quiet rebellion. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now lingered longer at mailboxes, offering warm smiles to my father or subtle nods to me. Small acts of defiance bloomed around the neighborhood. A retired couple hung their once-banned wind chimes again. A young family placed a cheerful gnome army in their garden. And Bob left his grill out for 2 days straight, as if daring Karen to object. Karen, meanwhile, marched about with brittle dignity, her clipboard clutched so tightly it seemed an extension of her arm, but the edges of her authority had begun to fray. Her loyalists whispered behind closed doors, and even the HOA board members exchanged uneasy glances when she delivered her speeches on standards. I kept my preparation methodical and quiet, meeting once more with the attorney who had advised me to supplement the case with additional testimony. Together, we assembled affidavits from neighbors who had faced Karen's bullying, along with official letters from disability advocacy organizations confirming my father's rights. By the time the final court date arrived, the binder had become a weapon so comprehensive that even Karen's arrogance could not withstand its weight. The courthouse was crowded on the morning of the hearing, the story having spread beyond our lakeside enclave. Reporters from the local paper loitered on the steps, sensing drama that could stir the community's interest. Inside, the air crackled with expectation. Karen arrived early in another meticulously chosen suit, her lips painted a defiant crimson, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. My father wheeled in beside me with quiet strength, wearing the same veteran's cap he had worn for decades, a symbol of the service Karen had dared to disrespect. As the judge called the room to order, the murmurs hushed, and an almost electric silence settled. The judge reviewed the case summary once more, then glanced up and in a firm, deliberate voice addressed me not just by name but by title. "Mr. Mayor, please proceed with your statement." The words sliced through the room like a thunderclap. Karen's face drained, of color as recognition flickered across her features. The clipboard queen who had built her power on intimidation was suddenly staring at a man whose authority outstripped her wildest pretensions. The whispers among the audience swelled into an audible gasp that I laid out the evidence with calm precision, referencing laws and precedents, exposing her selective enforcement, and underscoring the moral failure of punishing a disabled veteran for simply accessing his own home. The judge's questions to Karen grew increasingly pointed, probing the lack of consistent standards and the hypocrisy of her unapproved shed, extended pathway, and illegally parked boat trailer. She faltered, her voice cracking under the weight of her own contradictions. When the ruling finally came, it was decisive. All fines against my father were dismissed. The HOA was ordered to issue a formal apology, and Karen was reprimanded for misuse of authority, with a directive for the board to hold a vote of no confidence regarding her leadership. The courtroom erupted in a wave of murmurs and relieved laughter, the tension of months dissolving into cathartic release. Karen stood frozen, clipboard hanging limply at her side. As the judge's gavel echoed through the chamber, a sound that signaled the end of her reign. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed. The HOA board, emboldened by the judge's words and the community's renewed courage, voted swiftly to remove Karen from her position. Without her iron grip, the air around the lake seemed lighter, freer. Neighbors stopped by my father's porch with pies, flowers, and kind words, thanking him for enduring her cruelty with grace. Bob, grinning ear to ear, fired up his grill and hosted an impromptu block party where laughter replaced the old tension. The Martins rehung their bright shutters, and children chalked cheerful drawings on sidewalks without fear of reprimand. My father, sitting proudly on his ramp with a cup of coffee, looked out at the lake and remarked that the water had never seemed so calm. For me, the victory was never about embarrassing Karen. It was about restoring dignity and community, about showing that bullies cannot thrive where people stand together. The mayor's title had given my words weight, but it was the unity of neighbors and the strength of principle that delivered justice. Karen retreated from public view after her ouster, her once feared presence reduced to an occasional, sheepish appearance on a morning walk. Without her clipboard and chorus of enforcers, she was simply another resident, stripped of the illusion of power. Sometimes I would see her glance toward my father's porch, her expression unreadable, perhaps regretful, perhaps resentful, but always subdued. The lake continued to shimmer under golden sunrises, but now its waters reflected something more, a community that had reclaimed its kindness and learned that courage could bloom even in quiet places. Standing beside my father one evening, I watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the water in hues of fire and gold. I thought about how close fear had come to fracturing this neighborhood and how a single act of resolve had flipped the balance. The ramp remained where it belonged, a testament not only to my father's independence, but to the idea that justice, once set in motion, can restore harmony to even the smallest corners of the world. The story of Karen's clipboard kingdom and its collapse would be told on porches and at barbecues for years, a reminder that power built on arrogance crumbles when confronted by patience, preparation, and the collective strength of decent people. And as the evening breeze stirred the marigolds at the base of my father's ramp, I knew that peace, the kind Karen could never find or threaten, had returned to stay.